I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen bee.
Camilla expected a routine briefing. Instead, one carefully worded sentence changed the atmosphere around her completely. Princess Anne had quietly authorized a new ceremonial arrangement for the Royal Garter, moving Camilla away from the prominent lead position she believed she would occupy. No public argument had taken place. No warning had reached her first, yet when the revised order was placed before her, the Queen Consort understood immediately. Someone had redrawn the hierarchy without asking her permission. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla stared at the revised order. The Royal Garter, shorthand here for the ceremonial world surrounding the Order of the Garter, is tied to one of the monarchy's oldest orders of chivalry, where procession order and formal placement carry symbolic weight without changing constitutional authority. That was why this hurt. Anne had quietly reassigned Camilla's expected lead ceremonial position, placing herself at the head of the senior royal grouping, while moving the Queen Consort into a secondary place beside Charles. Camilla read the positioning twice, then set the page flat against the table. Her aide waited. She did not raise her voice. "Who approved this?" she asked, and the calmness made the silence heavier. The briefing document, the internal paper setting out ceremonial roles and movement, showed no uncertainty. Anne's decision had already been entered as the working arrangement, not offered as a suggestion awaiting approval. Charles entered moments later and recognized the tension before anyone explained it. Camilla said nothing at first. She turned the page toward him and pointed at the order of names. The king understood why she felt exposed. Procession positions would be seen, photographed, discussed, and interpreted by people who would never read the reasoning behind them. To her, this was not sequence. It looked like a public message about who mattered more. The answer made the wound deeper. Anne had used delegated responsibility, meaning authority temporarily entrusted to her, to coordinate senior family participation, and completed the alteration before the final ceremonial papers reached Camilla's household. That made the move clean on paper and difficult to reverse. Challenging it now would force Charles to transform a private disagreement into an institutional confrontation. Charles looked toward the aide and asked the question Camilla already feared. Why would Anne take that risk without speaking to either of them first? The aide hesitated. The reason reached back months, to a moment Camilla believed everyone had forgotten. Camilla could challenge the order, but first she needed to understand why Anne had decided the Queen Consort should no longer lead at all. Anne did not see the decision as revenge. Camilla could not experience it as anything else. That difference became the emotional center of the conflict. One woman believed ceremonial prominence should follow service, continuity, and unquestioned duty. The other believed her position beside the king had settled where she belonged. Neither needed to raise her voice. Their disagreement touched something more dangerous than personality. Who had truly earned the right to stand closest to the crown? Anne treated royal duty as something measured in hours, punctuality, and repetition. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had built her reputation around showing up, finishing the work, and refusing special treatment. To her, the Garter procession was not decoration. It was a working royal responsibility, tied to a ceremonial day, and she believed the person carrying the heaviest burden should not stand behind someone carrying less. Camilla felt the same ceremony differently. Her place beside Charles represented years of moving from public rejection toward acceptance inside the institution. The Queen Consort, meaning the wife of a reigning king, understood that titles mattered on paper, but public placement mattered in memory. Every step beside the monarch told the world that she belonged. Losing that position felt like watching decades of progress become conditional again. Anne sat alone with the ceremonial schedule and moved Camilla's name. She paused before making the change. She knew people would read meaning into it, and she knew the woman affected would feel the sting. Still, she continued. In her mind, avoiding discomfort would have been worse than making a decision she believed matched the work. Camilla spoke privately with Charles and admitted what frightened her most. She told him the reassignment made her feel as though her place could still be withdrawn whenever another royal decided she had not earned it. The king tried to separate title from procession order, reminding her that one did not alter the other. She answered quietly that the public would never make that distinction. Charles read Anne's internal reasoning and found something more troubling than rivalry. She had tied the new order to operational responsibility, meaning the practical workload each senior royal carried during the ceremony. Whoever carried the most, she argued, should lead the working formation. Then he saw the second instruction. Camilla was not to be briefed until the revised structure was complete, so emotion could not derail the decision. Charles understood the Garter dispute had started somewhere else. The procession was merely where the battle became visible. The real fracture had begun months earlier, during a ceremony where one private exchange changed Anne's view of Camilla for good. Months before the revised Garter order landed on Camilla's table, Anne witnessed a moment that stayed with her. It lasted less than 5 minutes. There were no cameras inside the room, no shouting, and no formal complaint afterward. Yet within this dramatized account, that brief exchange became the trigger for everything that followed. Anne watched Camilla step away from an obligation others were expected to absorb, and something inside the Princess Royal hardened. From that day, ceremonial privilege and ceremonial responsibility became inseparable in her mind. Anne arrived at the Windsor planning meeting expecting routine decisions, but the atmosphere changed once the schedule began to tighten. The gathering had been called to divide duties for a major commemorative service, including ceremonial greetings, procession responsibilities, and meetings with charity and military representatives. These assignments mattered because royal appearances that look effortless in public often demand rehearsals, long periods standing, careful timing, and repeated personal engagement. To the Princess Royal, accepting a prominent place meant accepting the work attached to it. Camilla studied the schedule and finally asked for one demanding sequence of greetings and a lengthy post-service reception to be removed from her block. The Queen Consort explained that the day had become overloaded and that other responsibilities were already competing for time. Anne did not argue. She immediately volunteered to take the entire sequence herself, and the speed of that response gave the moment an edge neither woman could ignore. Anne waited until the others had left before speaking. She looked directly at Camilla and said, "The front of the procession cannot be separated from the work behind it." The sentence was quiet, but the judgment inside it felt unmistakable. Camilla answered that being Queen Consort brought obligations her sister-in-law did not have to carry. Anne said nothing more, yet the silence between them became the real ending of the meeting. Anne later opened the future Garter planning file and wrote a private note beside it. Ceremonial precedents should reflect active participation wherever discretion allowed. Precedents, in plain terms, meant the formal order in which royals were placed during public ceremony. That single note became the seed of the reassignment months later. Charles eventually learned the full story through a documented account prepared by the private secretary who had attended the Windsor meeting. The king had assumed the tension between his sister and wife was only about temperament. Now he understood that Anne had turned the exchange into a principle. Charles also understood the danger. Reversing her decision would no longer mean changing two names on a page. It would mean rejecting the belief that had driven the change in the first place. The past now had a voice, and when Camilla finally asked Anne to explain herself face to face, neither woman could hide behind schedules, aids, or ceremonial language anymore. Camilla did not summon Anne through layers of staff. She asked for 10 minutes alone. When the door closed, the politeness remained, but the protection disappeared. Two women, who understood royal restraint better than almost anyone, were suddenly speaking about humiliation, entitlement, duty, and resentment without an aid available to soften the words. Camilla wanted her place restored. Anne wanted her decision understood. What followed was not an explosion. It was colder, quieter, and far more personal. Camilla opened with the question she had been carrying since the revised order reached her. Had Anne intended the change to look like a judgment on her standing? The Princess Royal answered without hesitation. She had challenged neither the marriage nor the title, Constitutional status, meaning a person's formal place within the monarchy, was not the same as a ceremonial assignment. To Anne, the distinction was obvious. To Camilla, it sounded dangerously academic. Anne explained that the revised working formation placed the royal carrying the largest ceremonial workload at its head. She believed that responsibility fell to her. Camilla pushed the document across the table and refused to accept the argument so easily. "They will see you ahead of me," she said, "and decide the rest for themselves." The Queen Consort knew symbols mattered because the public rarely heard the private reasoning that created them. Anne did not touch the paper. She held Camilla's gaze and said she would not apologize for carrying duties others had surrendered. The words landed hard. Both women knew immediately that she was speaking about Windsor. Camilla's voice tightened as she reminded her that one altered schedule did not erase everything else she carried. Anne answered that one schedule was not the reason for the decision. Anne then disclosed, in that private conversation, that she had reviewed months of ceremonial workload before moving the names. The reassignment had not been impulsive. She had already warned senior planning staff that visibility could no longer be separated from responsibility. That made the decision feel less personal, yet somehow more threatening. It meant the change rested on a principle Anne had been building quietly for months. Camilla asked the question that mattered most. Did Charles know before it happened? Anne said no. She had deliberately kept the king outside the process because asking him to judge between his wife and sister would have turned a working decision into a family loyalty test. Camilla's reply was immediate. "You have already made him choose." Anne finally looked away. The door reopened without reconciliation, leaving Charles with the one decision Anne had tried to prevent him from making, whether to intervene for his wife or allow his sister's order to stand. Charles possessed the highest title in the room, yet suddenly, that title offered remarkably little comfort. He could insist upon another arrangement. He could ask Anne to reconsider. He could shield Camilla from a public embarrassment she already felt approaching. But every option carried a cost. If he intervened too aggressively, the ceremony would become evidence that personal loyalty outranked service. If he remained silent, his wife would experience that silence as abandonment. For the king, the argument stopped being ceremonial and became painfully intimate. Charles understood that being monarch did not mean personally controlling every practical detail around a royal ceremony. Operational ceremonial planning, meaning the day-to-day organization of who stands where, who carries which duties, and how senior royals move through an event, could be delegated to trusted family members and household officials. Anne's influence came from that responsibility, not from constitutional authority over Camilla. Yet the distinction offered little comfort when the disagreement had already become personal. Charles listened as senior household staff warned that changing the order now might create more attention than leaving it alone. A sudden reversal would invite questions about why the original arrangement had been altered, and any official explanation risked exposing a private family conflict. The king knew the palace could survive criticism. What it could not easily control was the appearance that ceremonial decisions were being rewritten to protect his wife from embarrassment. Charles opened the planning memorandum alone and reached the section outlining Anne's workload argument. The memorandum, an internal document used to record reasoning and practical decisions, showed months of duties compared against ceremonial prominence. He removed his glasses and left the file untouched for several seconds. His sister's logic was difficult to dismiss. So was the pain he knew it would cause Camilla. Camilla confronted him before he could choose softer words. She asked whether he believed she had failed in her responsibilities. Charles immediately rejected that idea, telling her the issue was not her worth or her place beside him. The careful answer only wounded her more. She had wanted certainty, not balance. To the Queen Consort, his restraint sounded dangerously close to agreement with Anne. Charles then discovered a detail that changed the emotional equation. Anne had recently declined an opportunity to increase her own ceremonial prominence at another engagement, arguing that another senior royal had carried the greater burden. The king could no longer easily interpret her decision as ambition. Charles finally chose. He would not overturn the arrangement by command, but Camilla would remain unmistakably beside him and would never appear isolated or punished. The compromise protected her dignity, but when Camilla saw Anne's name still above hers on the final rehearsal schedule, she understood the deeper truth. Charles had allowed the decision to survive. Camilla thought she had prepared herself for the answer. She had not prepared herself for seeing it finalized. Anne's name remained first in the working formation. Charles had secured Camilla's visible place beside him, but he had refused to erase his sister's decision. That distinction meant everything institutionally and almost nothing emotionally. Once the revised schedule became final, Camilla could no longer tell herself the argument was temporary. The monarchy had absorbed Anne's judgment and continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Camilla read the finalized ceremonial plan slowly, knowing what its circulation meant. The document had now reached the relevant royal households, where staff were beginning rehearsals for timing, entrances, spacing, and assigned responsibilities. Once that machinery started moving, a reversal would no longer affect only 2 women. It would disrupt an entire chain of preparation. The Garter arrangement did not alter her royal title, but ceremony was where invisible rank became visible. That was why the change cut so deeply. Camilla dismissed her aides and remained alone with the schedule. She folded the page once, stopped, then unfolded it, and carefully smoothed the crease. The gesture was small, almost automatic, yet it revealed what she would never have said aloud. She could flatten the paper. She could not flatten the meaning attached to it. Charles had protected her from exclusion, but he had not restored what she believed had been taken. Sophie found her later and immediately sensed the difference. The Duchess of Edinburgh, a senior royal title held by the wife of the Duke of Edinburgh, listened without interrupting as Camilla finally admitted what sat beneath the anger. She feared acceptance had always been conditional. Years spent becoming part of the institution could suddenly feel fragile when one symbolic shift revived the old suspicion that she still had to prove she belonged. Sophie answered with something Camilla had not expected. In a private conversation between the 2 women, she explained that Anne had defended her before when harsher suggestions were raised about ceremonial roles. The Princess Royal had argued against reducing Camilla's involvement simply to satisfy critics. That revelation complicated everything. Anne could challenge her here without wanting to erase her elsewhere. Camilla began to see the conflict differently. If Anne would apply the same principle to herself, then this was not simple rejection. That made the wound harder to dismiss, but also harder to hate. Camilla made one decision. She would not ask Charles to intervene again. Instead, she requested another private meeting with Anne. The first conversation had been about position. The second would become about something far more dangerous to royal pride. Whether either woman was willing to admit the other had a point. No king mediated the second conversation. No private secretary recorded it. No ceremonial paper sat between them. Camilla entered knowing she could no longer force the question back toward status, and Anne arrived prepared for another confrontation. Instead, the Queen Consort asked something neither woman had expected. "If you believed I was stepping away from the work, why didn't you tell me before you moved me?" For the first time, the argument stopped being about precedence and became a conversation about trust. Camilla acknowledged that the Windsor schedule change had looked worse from Anne's side than she had understood at the time. She explained that competing duties and exhaustion had shaped her decision, but she also admitted something harder. She had never taken the time to explain that context personally. Precedence, the formal order in which royals are placed during ceremony, had become the battlefield only because the real problem had been left unspoken. Anne accepted her own part without hiding behind procedure. The Princess Royal admitted she had treated a family member like a logistical problem, convincing herself that an impersonal rule would prevent favoritism. Instead, her silence had made the change feel like punishment. Camilla heard the admission carefully. For the first time, Anne was not defending the decision alone. She was acknowledging the wound it had caused. Camilla then said what she rarely allowed herself to say. Being moved had reopened an old insecurity that decades of public acceptance had never fully erased. One wrong step, one altered position, one headline could make people act as though nothing had changed. The Queen Consort did not ask for sympathy. She simply wanted Anne to understand why the decision had landed with such force. Anne answered just as plainly. She had never considered Camilla illegitimate in her role. What she resented was the idea that seniority could become protection from the burdens everyone else was expected to carry. Her objection was not to Camilla's place beside Charles. It was to any system where prominence could survive without responsibility. Anne then offered something unexpected. If Camilla truly believed the revised arrangement damaged the crown, she would restore the original order herself. The offer changed everything. It proved she was not emotionally attached to winning. Camilla refused. Instead, she volunteered to reclaim one of the demanding ceremonial responsibilities she had previously surrendered, and told Anne the procession should remain exactly as planned. Their decision transformed the meaning of the ceremony before it even began. But the public knew nothing of that private exchange. Anne and Camilla had quietly reached an understanding, but outside palace walls, the altered order looked like something far more dramatic, and the reaction was about to turn a private compromise into a national spectacle. The public saw only seconds of what had taken weeks to resolve. Anne moved confidently into the senior working position. Camilla remained beside Charles, composed and unmistakably royal, yet the altered formation was impossible for experienced observers to miss. Within hours, every gesture carried invented meaning. Some saw humiliation, others saw duty being rewarded. The strangest part was that both interpretations contained fragments of the private argument, while completely missing the reconciliation that had already occurred behind closed doors. Broadcasters immediately stressed that Camilla's title and constitutional position had not changed. The Queen Consort remained the king's wife and retained her established place within the monarchy. Yet royal ceremony has always encouraged people to read hierarchy through physical placement, and the altered order quickly became the story. Palace staff described it only as an operational ceremonial arrangement, meaning a practical decision about duties and positioning rather than a change in formal status. That restraint prevented an official feud, but it also created a vacuum. Charles watched the coverage with growing discomfort. The king had hoped the compromise would protect Camilla's dignity while respecting Anne's reasoning, yet commentators were now reducing everything to a winner and a loser. He considered asking aides to push back more strongly. Camilla stopped him. She told him that any defensive statement would only make the situation look more serious than it was. For once, she preferred silence. Anne reacted differently, but with equal frustration. The Princess Royal disliked seeing the change presented as a personal conquest. In a private conversation with a senior aide, she insisted that Camilla had completed every responsibility assigned to her that day, and deserved credit for doing so. To Anne, the whole point had been duty, not humiliation. Watching the public turn that principle into rivalry made the outcome feel almost distorted. The frenzy peaked when a fictional evening newspaper appeared with the front page headline, "Anne steps forward," above a prominent image from the procession. A television broadcaster then froze the same moment and called it the most scrutinized change in royal ceremonial positioning this year. Outside Windsor, members of the public argued over whether they had witnessed a demotion or simply a working adjustment. The palace quietly released the full list of ceremonial responsibilities from the day. Observers noticed something unexpected. Camilla had carried a heavier schedule than many assumed. The simple humiliation narrative immediately began to weaken. By nightfall, however, the public argument remained loud. The headlines called it humiliation. The commentators called it a power shift, but the final verdict would come from Charles, Anne, and Camilla, the three people who knew why the position changed, and why nobody now wanted to change it back. The final conversation contained no triumph. Anne did not celebrate keeping the lead position. Camilla did not demand compensation for losing it. Charles did not pretend the conflict had been painless. Instead, the three confronted what the ceremony had exposed. Royal life becomes dangerous when symbols matter more than communication. But symbols also carry meaning, because responsibility gives them weight. What began as a quiet reassignment had forced each of them to decide whether pride or duty would define the outcome. Charles gathered Anne and Camilla privately after the ceremony, determined to end the dispute without creating winners or losers. The king made clear there would be no official statement framing the matter as victory or defeat, because nothing about Camilla's constitutional status had changed. Constitutional status, meaning her formal position within the monarchy, remained untouched. What had changed was the way the family understood prominence, responsibility, and trust. Charles then proposed a principle for future ceremonial planning. Prominence would reflect both established royal position and the work attached to each engagement, and disagreements would be discussed before schedules were finalized. The monarch told his sister the principle behind her decision was defensible, but the silence around it had caused unnecessary hurt. Anne accepted the criticism without argument. Camilla then admitted her first instinct had been to see the change as rejection, rather than ask why it happened. Anne looked directly at Camilla and said she had never intended to diminish her place beside Charles. The Princess Royal explained that her concern had always been responsibility, not legitimacy. Camilla answered that she finally believed her, not because the original order had been restored, but because Anne had offered to restore it and accepted her refusal without hesitation. That mattered more than any position in the procession. Camilla left the arrangement unchanged. The Queen Consort did not reclaim the lead role for that ceremony, and the decision no longer felt like surrender. She had discovered that a symbolic loss did not erase her identity, her marriage, or her place beside the king. Anne changed too. She understood that duty without communication could become cruelty, even when the principle behind it was sound. The verdict was clear. Anne had not defeated Camilla, and Camilla had not surrendered to Anne. Charles had protected his wife without overruling his sister. Camilla had accepted responsibility without accepting humiliation. Anne had defended duty without demanding dominance. The procession ended, the headlines faded, and the altered order remained, but its meaning had changed completely. The crown had survived because pride had finally made room for lasting trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.